You don't remember deciding to be strong. It just happened. At some point, things needed to be carried, and you were the one still standing. Not because you were ready, not because you wanted to, simply because stopping would have broken something that depended on you. So you didn't stop. You learned early that falling apart was not an option available to you. Other people could pause. Other people could fail loudly. You noticed how the world adjusted around them, how help appeared, how patience was extended. You learned not to expect that. When something went wrong, you fixed it. When someone needed stability, you provided it. When silence was required, you became quiet enough not to cause more damage. No one asked how much it cost. They only noticed when it worked. You became reliable before you became understood, and once reliability settled in, understanding stopped being necessary. People leaned on you without looking down. They assumed you would hold. You did, even when you felt yourself thinning. You learned how to keep your voice steady when it wanted to shake, how to show up even when nothing inside you arrived with you, how to answer "I'm fine" in a way that closed the conversation quickly. You didn't lie. You just shortened the truth until it fit into a sentence no one would question. At some point, you realized that being needed is not the same as being valued. But by then, you were already positioned in a way that made stepping back feel dangerous. If you loosened your grip, too much would fall. So you tightened it instead. You stopped asking yourself what you wanted because the answer no longer seemed relevant. Wanting suggested possibility. Possibility suggested risk. Risk threatened stability. And stability had become your responsibility. You watched other people move on, change directions, make mistakes, and recover from them. You told yourself you would do the same later. Later became vague, then theoretical, then irrelevant. You weren't living towards something. You were holding things in place. And no one marked that as sacrifice. They marked it as normal. That was the moment you understood. Not dramatically, not all at once, that your life had quietly shifted from being yours to being useful. And usefulness does not come with an exit plan. You don't notice when it becomes routine. That's the most dangerous part. At first, holding things together feels temporary, just until things settle, just until someone else steps in, just until you can breathe again. You tell yourself this often enough that it starts to sound true. Then days pass, then months. Then the idea of not holding everything feels foreign. You wake up already braced. Not anxious, prepared. There's a difference. Anxiety expects something bad. You expect something heavy, and you've learned how to lift weight without flinching. People come to you when things break. Not because you have answers, but because you don't fall apart while looking for them. You absorb panic without reflecting it back. You nod. You listen. You say, "I'll handle it." And you do. It becomes easier to handle problems than to explain how tired you are. Problems have edges. Exhaustion is shapeless. No one knows where to put it, so you keep it to yourself. You stop expecting recognition. Recognition would change the balance. It would suggest that what you're doing is exceptional. Exceptional things invite questions. Questions invite adjustments. Adjustments invite instability. So you present yourself as fine. You learn how to smile without warmth, how to laugh without release, how to say "it's okay" in a way that ends discussion. These are skills. You practice them daily. People begin to describe you with the same words. Strong, reliable, the one we can count on. They mean it as praise. You hear it as a warning. Because once people count on you, they stop checking if you can still carry the weight. They assume you will adjust. You always have. So why wouldn't you now? You notice that when you're overwhelmed, no one notices. But when you hesitate, even slightly, concern appears. Not for you, but for what might happen if you stop. That's when you understand the unspoken rule. You are allowed to struggle, as long as it doesn't interrupt anything. You begin to manage yourself the same way you manage everything else. You ration energy. You postpone rest. You tell yourself you'll recover later when things calm down. Things do not calm down. There is always another situation, another need, another moment where stepping in feels easier than explaining why you can't. Explaining requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires space. Space feels like a luxury you no longer have permission to take. So you don't take it. You continue. Even when you start to feel hollow in places that used to hold something alive. Even when joy arrives muted, distant, like a sound coming through walls. Even when you can't remember the last time you did something without calculating how it might affect others. You tell yourself this is adulthood, responsibility, maturity. You tell yourself everyone feels like this. But late at night, when nothing is asking anything from you, the quiet feels unfamiliar. Too open. Too honest. You feel the weight you've been carrying settle back onto your chest all at once. You don't cry. Crying would release something, and you don't know who would pick it up if you let go. So you lie still. You slow your breathing. You prepare for the next day. Because preparation is what you do now. And without ever choosing it, this becomes your life's shape. The loss doesn't announce itself. There is no moment you can point to and say, "This is where I disappeared." It happens quietly, through subtraction. A little less reaction, a little less curiosity, a little less urgency to explain yourself. You are still here, but not entirely. You notice it first in conversations. People talk at you, not with you. They bring problems, not questions. They assume your agreement before you speak. You nod because correcting them would take energy you no longer have. You stop sharing things that matter to you. Not because no one would listen, but because listening would require time, and you've learned not to ask for that. Time feels like something you spend on others, not something you're allowed to take. You realize that no one really knows how you are anymore. They know how useful you are, how available, how steady. But when they ask, "How are you?" they expect a brief answer. Something manageable. Something that lets them move on without adjusting their expectations of you. So you give them that. You become careful not to disrupt the version of you they rely on. Your inner life thins. Thoughts still exist, but they don't travel far. You stop imagining futures that don't include obligation. Those images feel irresponsible now, almost childish. You dismiss them quickly, the way you dismiss fatigue in the middle of a task. You tell yourself you'll return to yourself later. Later becomes a placeholder for something you no longer believe in. You notice how easily people move past your needs. Not with malice, with confidence. They trust you to manage. They trust you not to collapse. You have trained them well. Sometimes you catch yourself watching other people rest. Not sleeping, resting. Being unfinished. Leaving things unresolved. Letting someone else hold the weight for once. You feel a brief pull toward that possibility. Then it passes. You wouldn't know how to step into that role anymore. Your sense of self becomes quieter, flatter. You react less strongly to good news. Bad news feels expected. Everything begins to arrive at the same volume. This worries you briefly. Then you adjust to it, the way you've adjusted to everything else. You are not numb. You are efficient. You begin to measure your worth almost entirely by your usefulness. On days when you're needed, you feel stable. On days when you're not, a subtle unease sets in. If no one needs you, you're not sure what remains. That thought stays with you longer than you'd like. You realize, slowly, that being needed has replaced being known. And being known would require slowing down enough for someone to notice you. Not what you do, but who you are beneath it. You are no longer sure there is time for that. So you continue. You continue even as parts of you go quiet from disuse. Even as your own preferences feel distant, theoretical. Even as your life becomes something you maintain rather than inhabit. You are still present. You're still functioning. But the person who once felt things without translating them into responsibility has faded into the background. Not gone. Just unreachable. Buried under years of reliability. And no one around you sees this as loss. They see it as strength. There is no collapse. That's what surprises you most. You always assumed something dramatic would happen if you reached your limit. A breakdown. A moment where the weight finally became visible to others. But limits, you learn, don't announce themselves. They erode. You continue doing what you've always done. You show up. You respond. You carry. From the outside, nothing has changed. That becomes the quiet proof that nothing will change. People still rely on you. They always will. Not because you are the strongest person in the room, but because you have trained everyone around you to believe you can absorb what they cannot. They hand you responsibility the way one hands off an object they don't want to drop. Carefully, relieved. You accept it automatically. Refusal would require explanation. Explanation would require admitting that something inside you has been wearing down for years. You don't know how to say that without making it sound like failure. So you don't. You begin to notice that rest no longer restores you. Sleep pauses the day, but it doesn't give anything back. Mornings arrive without relief. You wake already tired, already calculating what must be held together before night returns. You tell yourself this is normal. Normal becomes a word that excuses almost anything. There are moments, brief, uninvited, when you imagine what would happen if you stopped, not dramatically, just quietly. If you didn't answer right away, if you didn't step in, if you let something wobble, the image never lasts. You immediately see the consequences. Who would struggle? What would fall apart? How quickly your absence would become someone else's emergency. You've seen that pattern too many times to pretend otherwise. So you keep going. Not because you believe in it, because you believe in preventing damage. At some point, you realize that people don't actually know how much you do. They know the result of it: stability, continuity, things working the way they expect. They don't see the cost because the cost is paid internally, in pieces too small to notice disappearing. You stop correcting misunderstandings. It's easier to be misread than to be fully seen. You notice that when you imagine the future now, it feels strangely empty. Not frightening, just undefined. You no longer picture milestones. You picture maintenance, keeping things from getting worse, holding the line a little longer. This doesn't feel like despair. Despair would require hope first. This feels like acceptance stripped of illusion. You understand finally that your life has not been about becoming anything. It has been about preventing collapse, quietly, consistently, without recognition. And that this role, once assumed, does not come with a clear ending. No one will tell you that you're allowed to stop. No one will notice the moment you've given everything you can. They will only notice if the structure fails. So you continue to function. You continue to be dependable. You continue to be the one who doesn't make things harder. You continue to absorb what others pass on to you because you always have. And if one day you disappear, not physically but inwardly, if something essential in you finally goes quiet from overuse, it will not be marked as a loss. It will be managed. Someone else will step closer. Someone else will take on what you once carried. The system will adjust. It always does. What remains of you will not be a story. It will be the fact that things kept working. For as long as you were there, to keep them from falling apart. And when you are no longer able to do that, the world will not accuse you. It will simply continue.